If you care about your privacy, chances are that you have heard of VPNs or you're using one right now. VPNs are a powerful way to protect one's privacy on the internet. But is there an alternative that is decentralized? Orchid is a new, decentralized bandwidth marketplace that is an open source VPN and guarantees no data collection, no third-party data sharing, and no profit markups. Download our VPN from orchid.com or visit the Apple or Google App Store and get started today for as little as $1.
Welcome to the Priv8 podcast, hosted by Derek E. Silva and brought to you by Orchid, the crypto-powered VPN that keeps your data private and allows you to explore the internet freely.
Hey everyone, and welcome to episode 100 of the Priv8 podcast, where we plug in and explore the intersection of privacy, human rights, technology, and democracy. I'm your host, Derek E. Silva. Today, we're speaking with two of Orchid's co-founders, Jay Freeman, sometimes known as Sorek, and Dr. Stephen Waterhouse, also known as Seven. 5 years ago, Jay, Seven, Brian Fox, and Gustav Simonson came together to found Orchid. 5 years later, we're taking a look at Orchid's original goals, how far the protocol and community has come, the narrative around crypto, and more. It's a terrific conversation, easily one of our best so far, and I really hope you enjoy it. And now, over to the conversation with Jay Freeman and Dr. Stephen Waterhouse here on episode 100 of the Priv8 podcast. Hey everybody, we have the immense pleasure of hearing from both Jay Freeman, aka Sorek, and Dr. Stephen Waterhouse, aka Seven, here on the Priv8 podcast today. Guys, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Terrific. Just a little bit of intro. People are really familiar with both of you, but a little bit of backstory, I think, on Orchid's history is due here since we've got two of the co-founders on the show. Jay, you are the founder of Cydia, most famously a prolific white hat hacker, or I think you sometimes call yourself more of a gray hat, and of course, a jailbreaker of iPhones and probably some other things. What led you from that world into blockchain technology and led you to help co-found Orchid?
So one thing to maybe note about my background is that I spent a lot of time doing academic study and working on a lot of projects before I was known as doing jailbreaking. A lot of my work related to static analysis, meaning extraction from software or language, but I was working on distributed systems technology. And this is before we had the cryptocurrency revolution that allowed for the incentive structuring and the economic analysis to really make it really work. This is something that was part of my background. I had been working for Brian Fox for a while at a consulting company here in Santa Barbara, and then he was brought on by some of the, including Seven, when Orchid was being started, and he brought in referral to me, and so because of my knowledge on distributed systems and network security, so.
Cool, terrific. And Seven, of course, before co-founding Orchid, you were already a well-known, established venture capitalist investor, the founder of several other successful projects. Can you tell us a little bit more about any extra background you want to share there and the path that led you to Orchid, please?
So somewhat and similar to Jay's experience in the early 2000s, I'd spent since 97 until 2 years ago, I was living in San Francisco, and so I'd kind of gone down the startup rabbit hole, doing many startups. And in the early 2000s, I was working on a startup building distributed search technology inspired by the technologies around Napster and Nutella and the kind of early, what was called peer-to-peer. Peer-to-peer means something different now, but that technology was very inspiring to me. And in some ways, I went down that, again, the rabbit hole of decentralized systems, really before we had the incentive structure that Jay mentioned to actually make these things work in a decentralized way. That technology then led to an acquisition by Sun, and then I worked on distributed storage systems, which was trying to rate data, kind of the way data centers work today, trying to make data centers work in a way where any machine can fail and things still work. So I'd had some initial exposure to that. A couple of startups later, I ended up at Fortress Investment Group and realized I was in a hedge fund. I wasn't sure what I was doing in a hedge fund. It was sort of, again, through acquisition. And a friend of mine suggested I check out Bitcoin, so I did. And then that led to teaming up with Dan Moorhead and working on Pantera, where I was a partner for 3.5 years. And at the back of that, I really decided I wanted to get back into startups. I missed the sort of being on the edge of it, even though it's very intense. I missed that being right on the edge of these systems and building something. So that led to lots of thinking over the course of a year, and ultimately came up with this idea that when we were getting together, trying to think through, in the founding team, trying to think through the problem specifically around censorship and surveillance, and thinking about, is there a better way to do what is often done by proxy networks or VPNs or other technologies, and was there an alternative way to think through that, and what benefits cryptocurrency and decentralized systems as they were back then, and obviously evolved a lot since then, what they could do to change that.
Yeah, we definitely want to touch on some of that evolution from where we started to where we are right now, and a lot of the narrative there. You're taking me a bit down memory lane, because I remember my first girlfriend introduced me to Napster, and I was like, what is this? Like, what is this black magic? I could just download any song from anywhere. And yeah, I don't do that anymore. I've got an Apple Music subscription and a Spotify subscription, because for the rest of the family.
There's this very strange feeling, which, especially with Nutella, which was a more decentralized version of Napster, that the searches actually propagated throughout the network, where you felt like you were peering into someone's computer in a way, connecting in and like taking a look at what they've got and then saying, please can I have this? And would you like one of mine? And you see these computers connecting to you, like, wow, this is so weird, like things are coming in.
I definitely got that feeling at the time.
It felt very different. It took me back to my earliest experiences with Unix back when I was doing my PhD, and just realizing like I could do weird things like connect to someone's screen and make creepy crawlies go over the screen for fun, just like take over the screen. It was like, oh, I've got control. It was like this all weird, like all the systems are connected, whereas a lot of the way we think about the internet back then, and especially now, is very much like a sort of centralized system, a client-server relationship, and you don't really feel like you're connecting to other people's computers. I mean, maybe Jay does, but
That's the grade coming back.
So for what it's worth, you actually had managed to throw me for a loop with the self-correction. I was really prepared when you finished your question to start going on an explanation of the difference between right hat and gray hat. I had the whole thing, and then you self-corrected yourself. And then I was like, oh, I'm going to actually answer his real question, and then I didn't have an answer. So to provide a little more detail, a little more context, one of the people I was working with at UCSB, his name was Peter Capello. And there was a system called GICOS, which was a distributed computation engine for Java, where you would take your problem, break it up into small parts, and then distribute that problem around to different computers. I mean, similar to something you might have, like folding at home or a SETI at home, things like that. Because it was built in the Java ecosystem, the idea was to be able to take the bits of computation as Java programs and then distribute that Java program to everybody, so that people would register their computers not to work on a specific task, but to do that kind of general computation work. The drive to figure out how to build some kind of way to collect all of that computation, to actually use one of Peter Capello's hooks from his from a lot of his papers. I mean, there's more gold in the oceans than man has ever managed to extract from the land, but it's all dissolved across the entire ocean. If you had some way of collecting all that gold into one place, it would be immensely valuable. It would probably destroy the ecosystem, to come to think of it. But figuring out how to do that in a way that was actually secure, where people weren't being able to lie about their problems and answers, or in ways that didn't manage to escape that Java sandbox, is something that it's taken the computer science realm the last 15 years to figure out. Actually, it's nearly 20 years, isn't it? To figure out how to really pull that off. And so the getting a chance to kind of re-enter that space in the form of working on this cryptocurrency project with Seven was something that was actually very exciting to me. But yeah.
Yeah, you also mentioned proxies. I remember that was huge when I was in high school, like 99, 2000, like, oh, we got to get we got to use a proxy. You got to use this one, because then you can get around the firewall at school, etc. Not that we were looking at anything illegal or that we shouldn't be according to our age at the time. Not at school. That would be stupid. But certainly, like, I want to check my Hotmail, and like all of a sudden Hotmail's blocked off because they don't want you checking your personal email at school. So I got introduced to Napster and proxies and stuff like that really early on, at least in my life. But and here I am now working with you guys on Orchid.
There are many VPNs targeted at high school kids. My son talks about them. It's primarily games and watching YouTube and things that are other video streaming, where they're like, well, the school's saying no, Then a lot of the time they just hotspot from their phone now, because with 5G so fast, so they just like, whatever, it's not that big a deal.
Yeah.
But definitely there's a lot of stuff focused around that area still.
So speaking of which, when we're recording this, at least, we're coming up to the 5-year anniversary of you guys founding Orchid, getting started. Orchid's original mission was to create an open, unrestricted internet, ideally owned by users, or that infrastructure owned by users. Why did the internet need a privacy solution or an unblocking solution like Orchid when you guys got started? Seven, let's start with you.
One of the inspirations was really looking at the geopolitical setup and how there is so much filtering of content, both in terms of what you can see, but also from the people watching what you do. And when you take situations where you've got journalists, for example, in very oppressed regions trying to just report, this is a very simple use case, they are using all sorts of techniques to filters and proxies in order to get out and be able to just communicate properly. And in many countries still, VPNs are either not available on stores, on app stores, or if they are, then they're actually also surveilled or blocked in different ways. So that concept of having something kind of like going back to the Napster days of just you could just download and use and would give you that access. And then also was incentivized, so you had mechanisms for growth and also reasons why people would want to keep using it from a monetary standpoint, and an easy way to pay without having to use normal banking mechanisms, which are also easy to curtail and censor.
Jay, anything you want to add there?
Seven's answer was exquisite. So, and the one thing I might wedge in there as sort of like a personal note is that I find the premise of intermediaries being able to not just control what people can see, but to see what people are communicating irksome. Like it squicks me, to use that term. It's this feeling of it's just not okay for people to be able to essentially be in that voyeuristic position over people's lives in order to be able to see the personal conversations that people are having with their significant others, and to be able to then decide that conversation externally went past some boundary that the platform did not like. And so I've always gravitated towards solutions that are designed to provide a very end-to-end experience where people who are communicating, or even whether it be one-to-one or whether it be one to a giant audience, are communicating with their audience, but are not inherently communicating with the world in a way where the world feels like it's their place to decide what should be said.
So I guess to that extent, things like HTTPS becoming normal has, I guess, helped. DNS largely is not encrypted, which I think is the biggest problem. We're heading in that direction, it seems. And you have all sorts of third-party solutions you could utilize, which either mix your data with a lot of other people's, and if you're not the ISP, or if it's not your ISP's DNS, maybe that helps with a little bit with at least obscuring who you are potentially. But like, do you typically use like a third-party DNS and things like that in order to help obfuscate that? Because without casting aspersions abroad with platforms like WeChat and the Chinese Communist Party, of even at home in the US there, you have ISPs like AT&T, which I remember a few years ago were like very clear, like, yeah, we're going to start collecting all your data and like your DNS data, and we're going to start selling it to advertisers. And there was at least a minor uproar, but that's the default for lots of people. Like they get their modem up and running, they get connected, and they just go about their business instead of thinking about, oh, like Cox or Rogers up here or whoever is collecting this data could be selling it to advertisers. And it's just general everyday browsing data. So like, are you taking steps yourself to help protect against those sorts of things?
First of all, I kind of want to separate two thought processes here that are occurring. So when we talk about, first of all, we bring in the idea of the mission of Orchid, and the reason why I think that pretty much everyone at Orchid is working on this project. And we talk about to build an open, unrestricted internet and decentralized platform like that. And I think that goes well beyond things that we've so far released, so for things we've so far built. And so when you say, for example, like encrypted DNS and encrypted HTTP, I mean, these don't even scratch the surface to me of what the real problem on the internet is that the person that you end up talking to at the end still knows oftentimes what you're talking about. If you use encrypted DNS or HTTPS to talk to Facebook, and then you use Facebook to talk to somebody else, Facebook still those things. And so the vision that I think that we share is to try to really build something that can replace all of this. And that's something that a lot of people, for what it's worth, the cryptocurrency ecosystem have been doing. That's I think, a shared mission of the entire space. But that's something that Orchid's original mission, and I think Orchid's continued mission, has always been to move towards that kind of point. As far as something very, very local like that, alternative DNS, I mean, I think that there are trade-offs you have to consider. So if you merely use an alternative third-party DNS service, I mean, in some sense, you're just changing who has access to your data. And so if you, for example, are just switching from your ISP's ISP's DNS, and you're simply switching that to Cloudflare directly. Now, Cloudflare is in a position to know what almost everybody's doing, because between Cloudflare and Google, they kind of essentially own the alternative DNS market. I think you have to combine that with something like what we've been doing with Orchid, where you are intercepting DNS requests, whether they were designed to go there or not, and then rewriting them, transporting them to another location, and then attempting to export, essentially translate them to a different privacy domain. So, I mean, I think the big thing you can do with DNS isn't quite as much about using alternative DNS server, even if you continue to use your ISP's DNS, but you use your ISP's DNS as if you were coming from somewhere in North Dakota. That is a big difference from using your ISP's DNS from your computer. And so I hesitate a bit with the premise, and combine whether it's looking at it from kind of what we kind of have been wanting to do as with our lives and with this vehicle of Orchid, and whether it's what we've been kind of working on as a public product at this time. So,
okay, no, that's fair. You're the guest. You're more than welcome to, turn it around and make it into something you're more comfortable talking about, or you think is more important. Please, just go ahead and do that. Jay, I want to have you continue here. We are 5 years in to Orchid's mission and building. We've got iOS, Android, Mac OS apps, maybe potentially Windows and a Linux GUI at some point. And the DApp has evolved considerably over the last few years since it was publicly launched, the mobile app as well, or the mobile and desktop app. How do you feel like Orchid's mission has evolved over the last 5 years, if it has at all in your mind?
I don't feel like the mission has changed. I mean, to be very clear about that. I mean, I feel like, and whether you can go back to 2017, us talking with people on how would we narratively market this sort of thing, and we were talking about the natural internet, to the things that we're working on today. We've been attempting to build this, as your question had pointed out, open, unrestricted internet owned by users. And I think when you hear whether it be me or Seven talk about the issues that we experience, I think that that's something that we're heavily driven by. And so I don't feel like the mission has changed, nor do I necessarily feel like the mission should change at this point. And mission, maybe one day, wouldn't it be glorious if it were complete in the sense that the internet was? But I feel like that's something it may be a never-ending mission in that sense, because I think that it's a war. It's a tension between the people who are attempting to be able to live their lives and be able to have those kind of direct interactions with the powers that be that feel it very important to be able to maintain their control over others. And so, given that the power dynamic that is inherent in such a statement, you may see a cat and mouse game essentially arise over the course of decades or forever.
I mean, I think we saw this in the last couple of years of the pandemic, where I'm living in Europe now, and we have GDPR, and we have all these opt-in, opt-out kind of things. And meanwhile, there's a European COVID passport, and we all opt in with all our data, and we KYC to go into stores. And we may be getting protection on the internet, but we opt into data collection all day long. And many times people think this is no big deal anymore. And most people in China think it's no big deal to have the government watch you. I think that's one of the challenges, is that, as Jay was saying, it's a cat and mouse game. It's kind of like a war, and you're constantly pushing against the social norms. I mean, back in the 90s, I guess in the early 2000s, the idea that something like Facebook would exist and that much data would be collected and that much data would be provided seemed like kind of crazy, but everybody did it. and it wasn't no big deal.
Oh.
And people didn't care.
Yeah.
And then suddenly they did. And actually, they still don't really care. So it's like kind of a challenge, right?
About 2 billion of them seem to not care, at least not as much as you think they might care or should care.
They're happy to use Instagram, but then they like say, "Oh no" to WhatsApp, and it's like, but like,
oh yeah.
Sometimes, for what it's worth, it's not as much about caring, but it can also be about the trade-offs inherent that society has put on people, kind of forcing them in a position to use it. So I've experienced some people being very surprised recently that I have a Facebook account. I even use Facebook, but the issue partly is that, I mean, I live in an area dominated by college students who are doing a lot of their event scheduling using Facebook. The local governments know that. And so the county government even puts out a lot of notices on Instagram. And if you aren't using these platforms, you manage to then disconnect yourself not only from the surveillance, but you also disconnect yourself from useful news updates and potentially your friends who have bought in. It's a kind of an awkward peer network effect. Like it's a weird combination of peer pressure, the bad version of network effect that can lead people to almost feeling like, well, do I have a choice? Can I care? I don't know if I can care.
Yeah. Yeah. Very reluctant. Like I still have an account primarily so I can manage Facebook pages because, like you said, like it's a very reluctant, this is where I reach people, right? And I can advertise to them if I want to give Facebook some money or Meta some money and stuff like that. But for me, it's a very reluctant acceptance that Facebook is here. And for now, at least it's here to stay. You know, usage and growth appears to be slowing, if not declining in some areas, but there's still, at least I'm sure in Facebook's mind, there's still another 5 or 6 billion people that we haven't reached yet. So let's keep going. A huge proportion of the crypto projects that have actually been launched, especially over the last couple of years, have been finance related. You know, we got DeFi Summer 2 years ago. Orchid's growth as a privacy solution has kind of bucked this trend. Where would you say Orchid falls in the broader blockchain and tech ecosystems when it comes to delivering an actual decentralized product that isn't directly finance related? We have monetary incentives, obviously, to keep the network running, but it's not like it's not a DeFi, project in that sense. Tevin, I think you're more heavily involved in this area or aware at least than I am, and maybe Jay. Oh, I know Jay's got thoughts.
Back when the phrase Web3 meant something completely different and kind of meant like decentralizing the web, that was really the category that we fell into. And concepts like decentralized storage, decentralized processing, and in our case, decentralized bandwidth and programmable bandwidth are, as you mentioned, quite distinct. That's not to say that the financial mechanisms built in and with many things that have been designed in DeFi can't be used because we do have a tokenized architecture. It's a different kind of push for the area that we're focusing on. It's I think, in some sense, somewhat of a kind of a longer play. Because there's many more things to kind of figure out, and adoption is different to just jumping on a new DeFi project and connecting MetaMask and all good, go buy an NFT and trade and so on. These are somewhat lower barriers to entry and somewhat lower education in terms of why people don't use them. I feel the privacy angles have increased in awareness. There's many projects now, whether it was originally Zcash and, of course, Monero, and then more recently things like MobileCoin, and then Starkware on the zero-knowledge proof area, and then many different versions of different zero-knowledge proof architectures and new advances in that area that are becoming very interesting. So I think that aspect and the idea that you can use these privacy-enhancing techniques and zero-knowledge techniques just for scaling, which is where the primary use case has been used for in many cases, and so far in Ethereum EVMs, but now we're starting to see people also become aware that, well, perhaps there's ways. There's a project, I think it was Sisypho, I was looking at today, where it allows you to do attestation. So you can say, I've got this collection of NFTs, but I don't actually want people to know that it's my wallet, but I can prove that I've got these NFTs by using this attestation zero-knowledge technique. So I think we're starting to see like people are building those kind of ideas into play. I think the merger of a lot of what's happened in the DeFi space, which has been very valuable in terms of how you build things, not just DeFi projects, but others, with what we're doing, will be an interesting combination of the next few years.
Maybe to underscore something that Seven said there, we was talking about the breadth of projects that have existed that have been outside DeFi. I think sometimes there's almost a misconception that the space has become DeFi. I think it happens in a couple ways. One of which is that the speculative ability for people to potentially make money out of something like DeFi can be very high in a very short term. And that leads a lot of people to shill and kind of hype it up in ways that then ends up kind of drowning out a lot of other conversations. I also would say that the amount of money that can be made per transaction on underlying system can be higher when you're talking about something that's designed to make money, as opposed to something that is designed as where making money is part of an incentive system in order to accomplish a goal. And so you see, I was speaking with some artists yesterday about this, and so it kind of really fit this narrative of like gentrification almost, where you've got a bunch of artists who are utilizing a space, such as, for example, even NFTs, and they are building these NFTs, they're selling their artwork, and then that blockchain that they're working on becomes popular, and so all of the finance people come in and they start buying up all of the metaphorical real estate by using up all the transaction volume in order to do their high value DeFi, which then causes all of the artists to need to flee to a new location. And so you see this kind of movement through the like migration path through the ecosystem, looking for where is the next low value real estate where people can operate. But then the worst thing that can happen is you go there, you set up your NFT shop, and then people start utilizing it. And then, now DeFi moves in. Now your NFTs are too expensive to transfer again. And so I think that property makes DeFi look really looming in a way where I feel like we've continued to this whole time to have, whether they be fun projects or whether they be important projects that are operating at lower value per transaction or lower levels of speculation.
Yeah, you saw that with Tezos in the last 6 to 9 months, right? It was like suddenly all the artists moved to Tezos, and then suddenly Tezos goes up in value because everyone's using it, and it's like, oof, who's next?
I was at VidCon over the last couple of days, and Tezos has a ginormous booth there, massive presence. Yeah,
it's crazy. I never thought Tezos would be the thing that would be NFTs. It's a completely different design.
I would have to agree with you. When that picked up, I think, about 6 months ago, I noticed that was happening. I was like, oh, I kind of forgot about Tezos, and not obviously that didn't mean that they weren't continuing, that they weren't building good stuff. I just, I remember baking some rolls or whatever the staking term was called at the time, and then I got out of that, and then I just kind of moved on, and because all the action seemed to be elsewhere, and then it just kind of. Maybe not a sleeping giant, but just, for me, it came out of nowhere.
On another note, though, it is fascinating from the perspective of the idea that we'll live in a cross-chain universe and multiple chains that you can interact with, and all of a sudden you may just see some chain pop up because, hey, people find an interesting use case for it. And in the case of Tezos, that was with largely generative art NFTs, and a lot of the top artists from Ethereum kind of moved over there and tried it out.
So what about your thoughts on the ways that the crypto industry is perceived externally versus what folks like yourself and others are doing internally? Like I saw Mr. Wonderful, Kevin O'Leary, sorry for that export, from Canada, who was poo-pooing Bitcoin and Ethereum for a long time, all of a sudden is in Forbes or Wall Street Journal or whatever, because he's continuing to buy the dip and stuff like that. That's what gets shown a lot on mainstream media, if you want to put it that way. Meanwhile, Orchid is building really important stuff. We've had people from Akash on the podcast as well, and other people building, decentralized or at least distributed systems similar to Orchid, or in a similar way or with similar goals. Do you feel like that narrative is really out of whack with what's actually happening, or do you think that maybe it's more aligned with where the industry is, or at least where people are actually focusing their time if you're working in crypto, blockchain / Web3?
So I think in February I'll be coming up on a decade in this space. And it takes me back to laughing many years ago when I was looking at some posting for some consulting firm trying to hire crypto people, and they wanted like a decade of experience in blockchain. I just laughed. I was like, wow, the thing's on it. It's like, that means you're Satoshi, like back then, it was like 2018. And but now I will soon have a decade of experience in this strange little space. My perspective on why I like it and why I'm interested in it hasn't really changed. I think these decentralized architectures are very interesting for many reasons. You've heard many of them from the perspective of Orchid. I've also thought a lot about early on the concept of banking the unbanked. I think that was always thought that's very interesting. I think very important. DeFi, I think, is really interesting from the access to financial products and the ability to really understand and make more transparent the systems. If you look at what's happened without naming all the names, which we can do if you like, but the projects and the characters that have caused a lot of the recent pain, with the exception of Terra, have been primarily centralized systems that haven't had the transparency in them. And there's challenges when you do have transparency, because in the case of Terra, when you do have transparency, then it's actually clear. You're like, here's a big bullseye. If you go after this, you can take us down. And people knew what it took to take them out. When you get interested in an area, and it's an area we can talk about the volatility, but we can also talk about volatility in the last year or two in the private startup space in terms of funding for those projects. A lot of these things are really very volatile internally, and the sort of 20 years I spent in San Francisco and Silicon Valley taught me this, is that if Twitter had started and it immediately had a token that was traded after 6 months or a year or something, which is the case of many things, then, when Jack Dorsey wasn't feeling well, maybe the price of the token would have crashed. And then, when the entire space was going up and down, maybe the triple would go up and then come down. And this kind of inherent volatility in what are very small companies, ultimately, very small projects, is not really that wild. And also by the fact that we have things like, we have 24/7 markets. There's no backstop. No one's coming to bail these systems out. So yes, these swings and volatility is really inherent into a lot of what is happening in the financial aspect of it. Whenever I'm coaching somebody on either joining the space or staying in these spaces, I try and encourage them to think through the reasons why they do these things. And you have many reasons. Just go and make a bunch of money is fine too. But if you want to do these things for a while, it's usually you've got to have some aspect of, you got to kind of get crypto pilled somehow. To be the decentralized pilled. You got to it's got to mean something to you. Otherwise, just got to do something else, like a real estate, or there's plenty of things to go do in the world. I think crypto's coming for all of them eventually, but that's another. But you don't have to do that. There's plenty of things to do.
Software's been eating the world for a few years now. It's not, that doesn't seem to be slowing down.
I think it's third or fourth bull bear cycle, I guess now. So it's I watch Bitcoin go from 30 to 1200 and then 1200 to 200 and then do many things along the way. So it's always a bit more. I think leverage has been a really big aspect and a theme of this last one that we're still on. So that's been the defining moment, I think, of this year is leverage. So.
Seems to be that way. Jay, what about your perspective on the narrative, especially external versus internal, if we could put it that way?
I've actually found this somewhat kind of demoralizing at times recently. One recent note on this has been the letter from prominent technologists to the government, to Congress, imploring them to ignore any of the people from crypto telling them anything. Trying to prevent, certain kinds of very centralizing regulation in that sense. When I engage with people who are sitting outside of crypto, one of the things I found is that they don't know much about the good work that's been done, but they do see and hear about all of the bad work, and that's something that I in some sense can't exactly blame them for, because there is so much bad work that has been done in the name of crypto due to all of the get-rich-quick schemes and scams that have managed to kind of take over the airwaves. They make enough money per shilling event, right? That it actually is really valuable to them to attempt to be loud and all over. When I will mention to people who are, in cryptocurrency, it never does anything. There are never any projects that actually, there's a service. There's never a service. And I go, well, actually, there are distributed computation, bandwidth services. There are distributed storage networks that some people are actually utilizing. Is sometimes a little bit confused about them, but Helium may actually have actual corporate large partners that they're working with. And it's when I mention these projects, they're like, I've never heard about any of those. Then sometimes they'll challenge, can you give me a list of such things? Then I start giving them lists like the one and it's just I don't know directly how to deal with that, because the narrative in some sense, as I said, isn't entirely wrong. The extent to which the things that you hear about from crypto are people promising ridiculously large returns because you simply staked some token somewhere and therefore you'll get returns without having to actually do any work for that high return, such as running computers, doing system administration, dealing with the risks that might be involved in operating certain things. It's distressing, and it's something where I find myself oftentimes having to be on the narrative defense in that regards to even be able to discuss what it is that I do now. And it's something that I wish there was more essentially action in the crypto community to calling out the space itself. I mean, I feel like I am both somebody who's working in crypto and is now known in crypto circles to do things, but since before I got involved in Orchid, I've been known as anti-crypto. I mean, there was a big discussion over on some subreddits a long time ago about why Sorek won't accept Bitcoin in Cydia, and there were very practical reasons why that didn't make sense at the time. Interestingly, the narrative has shifted now, such that no one even really expects that anymore. But I feel like there needs to be that balance that the people who are operating in this space need to at all times not come off as having fully bought into the Kool-Aid of everything you hear, but are calling each other out and are separating themselves from that kind of churn of scams. So
yeah, it's definitely something that I get really frustrated with. Like, I'm a volunteer mod for that general #DeFi Telegram group, and just keeping that thing clean of really obvious shilling, whether it's 2 people or whether it's 5 people, is it's a part-time job in itself. Thankfully, I'm not the only one.
I joined some Discord recently. I'm not even certain which ones. I'm on so many, and now I simply get like 5 a day. I get direct messages telling me to join World of Pumps, which is both somebody both a bunch of spam in order to try to get me to essentially lose, but is itself a scam, right? It's also like, we're going to take this cryptocurrency, we're just going to try to arbitrarily, I mean, it's just like the whole thing, it's just like, it's a scam about a scam. Like, I don't even...
Yeah, crypto pumps and dumps, let's go, rockets. Like, it's incredibly annoying. I get those too. And after like 3 or 4, and even like the ETH Global, like the Discord they used to organize the hackathons and everything, they get that sometimes. So it's super annoying. But I often am looking at these coins and I'm like, okay, we had Shiba Inu. Well, first we had Doge, and then we had Shiba Inu. Super cute, fine, whatever. And then you get Flocky Inu, and you get Flocky Inu Elon Musk, and Flocky Inu, like all these like derivatives. It's just like, it's the same pump and dump scam ultimately all the time. I'm just waiting for, like, after this, I'm going to wait for Flocky Inu Sorek 7, token to launch, or maybe I'll do it myself just for fun. I'm like, guys, like, at least have a little originality. Like, you're literally just taking the same prefix and adding stupid new words after it. But I think this is a really good time to talk about, like, when it comes to the narrative. Like, Seven, you've actually you did a talk at ETH Denver about how crypto was essentially a punk movement originally, right? Taking control back from the man. Do you feel like that narrative is getting through? Do you, like, are you continuing to evolve that message? Like,
I keep giving the talk, so hopefully they keep asking me to give the talk. I'm giving the same one in Paris. It's like the early days of tech, and Jay can really talk to this in his work too. I'll just say, like, I had a lot of misfits, a lot of people who just really wanted to push against the boundaries of what was considered normal, what was considered, like, kind of possible. And if you're doing startups, that's also like a lot of your thinking process. Like any sort of revolutionary kind of movement, eventually it gets popularized. You have this sort of gentrification of that space. And now we have tech bros, and people do startups and they have like portfolios in Silicon Valley. There's this thing where no engineer was expected to stay anywhere more than 18 months, because then they invest a year, they take 6 months chilling and trying to find the next thing, and then get to the next thing. And then they have, after 4 years or 5 years, 6 years, they have a portfolio of different companies. So if one of them worked, they made it. And if not, then it's okay. They weren't locked in. This idea of sort of trading off your experience like that was just anathema to people who started things and really cared about them. And loyalty in startups was much stronger in the early days. Yeah, the CryptoPunk kind of talk is really a play on the popular, one of the very earliest punk NFTs, and the CryptoPunk NFT. What I'm trying to say in this talk is, again, what I was saying is trying to think more radically, trying to think in a more fundamental way about what your beliefs are about the work that you're doing. And I don't mind if you're just in it for the money, great, go for it. But if you're building things, most likely the thing that gets you out of bed is some excitement about what it is. And I think that focusing on systems that are fundamentally more decentralized than the things that we've built in the past is an important distinction, and being more radical in the way that we think about things. So taking more risks, and I don't mean more risks like trying to bend regulations or trying to, kind of buy Bitcoin at 69K. It's like, this is like the risks where you're thinking through, like, what could I do that would actually disrupt something significant and may take me longer than 6 to 9 months to launch a token and make a bunch of money. But what can I do that's going to really try and change an industry or to create a new kind of behavior? What I'm encouraged by is that I think that the last few years, and even the last year especially, with a lot of what's happened with other chains and the ability to really start to scale things by using these different chains, the ETH merge is not going to help with scaling necessarily, but these kind of ability to use different chains, and some of them even have sharding in, is helping with some things there. And we're also have been building a lot of infrastructure. This is the stuff that doesn't get talked about in the press. These kind of like components of infrastructure. Yeah. When we originally started working on Orchid back in 17, 18, it was actually a bit of a question as to whether we would do it on Ethereum. It was kind of like, I don't know, like, this thing is good for ICOs, but like, let's take a look around. What is it? And we ended up choosing Ethereum, largely in part to a lot of the tooling that was available. But the space has moved up an order of magnitude in terms of tooling, infrastructure, the capabilities of things that you can just build. And that is somewhat reminiscent of the early days of mobile, the early days of kind of, Web 2, as we didn't know it was Web 2 back then, but just like apps that you built out then in the early days of really how the internet and the web really scaled in the sort of mid-2000s. So I'm hopeful that we'll start to see applications, and we are starting to see certain games, and hopefully we'll see other kind of things that will be able to use this kind of infrastructure and then quickly start deploying things, because that's ultimately outside of DeFi and rewiring a financial universe, which is still fascinating. When you want to get to consumers, you need to have things that are actually going to spark interest and do something where they don't have to really care whether they're using crypto or not. It just is.
Jay, do you have anything to add there?
I think Seven is the expert on punk movement here at Orchid, so I'm happy to lean on his answer there.
Jay, I want to bring this over to you. One of the things I don't like that are happening right now, at least depending on how it's designed, is this idea of central bank digital currencies. China is going to do what they do. We all know, their MO and their rationale for issuing the digital yuan, working directly with WeChat, Alipay, et cetera, WePay, Alipay, et cetera, and making sure there's a lot of information they can get back out of that. Lots of other jurisdictions are playing around with various designs, and personally, I have a lot of thoughts on how it can work and still preserve some privacy, and like cash typically does. I fear like we see some potential designs and some tests where it's going to be incredibly intrusive. Do you have any sort of sense about, or like your opinion on CBDCs or other government issued digital currencies, how to do it well, how not to do it well? Is it something you just absolutely hate, should never happen? Like, where are you at with that?
A really big part of what we've kind of built in the currency ecosystem for me is the programmability and the permissionless participation. A lot of P words there, I guess. That's something that when I think about what government would want to do in that space, I feel like it would not go in that direction. I feel like that we would see things that are more about large scale transaction only settlements for banks, and that we would see it as being not just KYC, but potentially the level where it largely is kind of like a back-end primitive designed for the financial industry to do, again, settlements between like replace maybe ACH, SWIFT, interbank transfer mechanisms. And while I think that that's a worthy thing to do, when I think about it, it's not that I'm terrified they will do it. It will ruin the world. I think that it's probably a good thing that they do that. I'm concerned about the extent to which the work that's being done in the cryptocurrency space then is just considered to be, well, that's bad or silly, and that should be regulated away. Well, whatever benefit there was, we now can demonstrate with our central crypto, system. I'm hoping my hope is that it's essentially orthogonal, that it's nigh and ancillary to the work that we do, and it just kind of rides the same coattails. But I don't know. Seven might honestly know a lot more about this.
Yeah, Seven, your thoughts on the government-issued digital currencies?
Yeah, I'm not a big fan. It's like, I don't believe in Christmas or something. It's like, well, it still happens whether you believe it or not. It's like, I don't believe in CDCs. Well, good luck with that belief system. I definitely agree with what you're saying. I guess my kind of warning and concern is that, just like we saw with file sharing, going after Napster and Nutella didn't sort of make this stuff go away. And we still have torrents. Yes, there are people who get locked up and locked up, but like big fines for using a BitTorrent thing in the wrong place at the wrong time and not using the right kind of protection to do it. But it still happens, and that move to try and criminalize it, in some ways, I think really set, for example, the music industry back a long way when they could have potentially sort of embraced that in some different way. I don't have a full strategy. Sean and those guys talked a lot about this. Crypto's been coming along much longer than Napster did when it kind of got slapped down. So not similar, they're not the same. But I am concerned that if there's a big move to say the CDBC kind of world is good and these other things are bad, you may end up with something worse than what we have right now. You may end up with like even worse things happening in the crypto so-called dark space that are really hard to figure out and really hard to regulate around and really hard to prevent. So that's one concern. In general, I think the big danger is the idea that you can program the way that money is used. So if I give you cash right now, it's like no one's going to come in and say, actually, sorry, you really can't use that $100 bill to go buy beer. You can only use it to buy diapers because you're a dad. And this is the canonical example. But if I give you USDCBC, right, then, or Canadian version, then I can go in and I can censor that. I can say, actually, this can only be used here. And that's very simple to do. This isn't some magic technology. We know exactly how to program those systems today. I do think that we will see a slew of regulations in the next couple of years. Some of them misguided, some of them probably sorely needed in many areas. I'm not a big fan of trying to regulate these systems primarily because they are moving so quickly that we end up writing a whole bunch of rules on things that we don't really understand. And that's one of the dangerous things. The flip side of that is that then people go build systems and ape into these things and get burned because they are dealing with extremely volatile assets that they don't totally understand. And then they have centralized versions that try to mask that stuff, and they still don't understand what's going on. That's really sad.
Are there any regulations, maybe light touch or otherwise, probably light touch, that you hope will actually come through, like around the pump and dump type stuff, for example? I don't know how you would, considering how global the system is, and the fact that you can make a pancake swap pool without any KYC, but like.
Well, you got to think that through carefully, right? So the actual universe of people who know how to use MetaMask and Trezor and do even know what the hell pancake swap is or what chain they should use or how to change the chain and so on, it's a really small number of people. So anyone who's crying, saying they got burnt by using those kind of systems, I'm just like, come on, like. I think that it would be good if people had to sort of click and sign a form, like a little bit like you use Apple iTunes. Like, I don't know what I'm doing, but sure, yeah, whatever you say, give me the software. It's like the same kind of thing. You start to see this a little bit now in certain DeFi apps. It's like, yeah, click. I've read this massive long text from a lawyer. At least there's a little bit of barrier. It's not just like, hey, let's go. I think education's a huge part here. Because, for example, like one of the things we invested in Fabric is this European stablecoin Angle. And there are crazy incentives to go provide liquidity to this thing. And you can argue and say, well, what's the point of another European stablecoin? Like, we've already got a couple. And I was like, well, actually, they don't work very well, and they're kind of centralized. And this is a really interesting over-collateralized architecture. Now, should Angle be stopped from incentivizing people to provide high-risk liquidity to their pools? Like, should that be like, oh, sorry, you can't do that because you haven't KYC'd your users or read them this long piece of text and they haven't read all the rules, they haven't taken a training course? It's like, I don't know, if someone's crazy enough to put $1 million into that thing to provide liquidity, good on you. And they deserve the rewards, and rather sadly, they probably deserve to get wrecked if they get wrecked. And that's just the way it is. And they kind of know what they're doing. I think where it gets dangerous is where it's almost like the stuff like GameStop and AMC, which, there's a Wall Street bets world, is people get swept up by other people who know that they're trading a meme. They know they're trading a meme, like Shiba Inu, all these things you talked about. There are people trading these things that don't believe that Shiba Inu is going to replace the global monetary system. They just are trading a meme. And it's the question of how long can you stay in before someone pulls the bag and you run away. And they know they're doing that. And unfortunately, there's other people who get swept up in the idea because they're convinced by everyone's narrative that this is the next big thing. It is the next Bitcoin. And that it turns out to be the next Bitcoin and drops by 90%. So it's really, really bad. It ultimately, when you want high-speed innovation and rapid change and all the things that everyone gets excited for and governments get excited for and people are trying to create the next Silicon Valley, there are flip sides to these things, and it's kind of hard to build one without the other.
Jay, any sort of regulation you hope to see or at least expect to see in the next little bit? Probably on I think we covered the expect to see, but more so on the hope.
For what it's worth, I feel like a lot of the problems we have in the space are things where there are regulations surrounding them. But as you have already noted, it's a very global space. And so it is oftentimes, I'll be talking about some project and be like, how could they even be doing that? That just seems so illegal. And somebody else, well, no. Where are they located? Oh, yeah, they're not.
Oh, yeah.
And so
they're in Vietnam. It's like, oh, well.
Yeah. To me, the real question is about more what regulations do we have on the books that maybe shouldn't be removed, certainly about deregulating things, but that need to be edited or updated in order to take into consideration the existence of and advantages of blockchains. And so you see, for example, that we had a lot of regulations surrounding how banking and checking work, and then PayPal appeared, and we start seeing, even just Visa and MasterCard appeared. And we saw that a lot of regulations had to be updated in order to take into consideration payment cards and third-party payment networks. And I feel like these decentralized systems are things that need to be incorporated into those frameworks in a way that understands their advantages and doesn't purposefully hamstring those. And I've seen that work well in the past with these other systems. I mean, there are, in an attempt to build tax frameworks surrounding third-party payment networks, one of the things that they wanted to take advantage of was all of the reporting that can come from the third-party payment network, but they could have and then decided against requiring everyone who's using them to perform a bunch of back and forth reporting in addition, because they would have been a massive privacy invasion. It would have been, there were a lot of practical issues to it. And so they carefully cut through and carved out that noise. That's something where I think that right now we see a lot of places where we're having to take the existence of a blockchain and we're having to be like, well, what if you thought of it like a third-party payment network? Or maybe if you blur your eyes enough, this is suddenly a payment card. And now you can try to interpret it in the scope of some law. And you're like, okay, so if there was a bunch of stores in a mall and they accepted that card, how would that law apply to us? And it's just so confusing, ridiculous. I would love to see essentially the regulatory efforts go towards cleaning all of that up and appreciating the nuance, as opposed to just trying to slap a bunch of new regulations in places. If anything, I want to see the new regulations that come up on all the centralized systems. It's like, okay, we figured out that some parts of decentralization work and are possible. And as we prove more of that space, maybe the existing efforts that have been done on centralized systems that arguably should only have been allowed because, well, what else could we have done? Maybe we should start banning those. And if you start banning aspects of the centralized ecosystems because they inherently require a person who has complete control over everyone's accounts, or a person who is able to view everyone's information, and we decide that those are things that people shouldn't be in a position to do because people are inherently corruptible, that when you give them that kind of level of absolute power, it does seem to corrupt them absolutely, that we just make it not allowed. And now we can start actually all of these things where people are saying, well, it's like, you could build a decentralized system, but wouldn't it be just a little bit cheaper to build if it were centralized? It's like, yeah, but then it's centralized. What if you could just, well, centralized systems not allowed because it has this person that is controlled. That's where I really would love to see regulation go.
Okay. I haven't heard that take before. So I think that's a really interesting one. We got time for two more questions here. So, Jay, we'll start with you. What role do you think community governance is having in shaping the future of crypto? We've seen a lot of experiments over the last few years. MakerDAO is certainly, I think, the most famous and probably the most well reputed at this point. They've iterated a lot. Some decisions that certainly confused some people over the last little while, like the content or the marketing team just being ejected at some point last year. But regardless, they've really stood the test of time. DAI works, Sai worked before that, the single back. What role do you think, or will community governance have in shaping the future here?
One point that needs to be made first is to kind of separate the space of governance. And so we see governance projects that are fully automated on-chain voting mechanisms that lead to on-chain updates, oftentimes of constants like a fee percentage or of even a code update that might happen on-chain with a delegated contract. And then there are governance projects that effectively feel like companies, where the idea is that people go on a forum, make proposals, there will be a voting process that it takes place. The voting occurs on-chain based upon the ownership of the token. But a lot of times the actions then are something that require humans to do the follow-through on. These two systems share some issues. We've seen this massive shift, I think, in when people talk about DAOs from the former to the latter. And I think that is somewhat distressing. So at a high level, I will say that I have been simultaneously disappointed in, terrified of, and even enraged by a lot of the attempts that people have had of pushing governance through to various projects. So first of all, I'm an elected government official, and I've been sitting inside of, when you see how the sausage gets made of government now for 6 years. The feeling of sitting in there and really actually seeing happen situations like, well, we took a vote of the people, but no one really showed up. Yes, the majority of the people who voted definitely agreed with this thing, but it was a tiny majority of the people. Do we really have a mandate from the people on this tax? And we see that happening in governance systems. We saw I think it was last week, there was a 1.13% quorum vote that was taken in order to by Solend in order to change the rules and confiscate some assets and do I'm not even saying that the thing that they were trying to do was bad, but the fact that it was a 1.13% quorum to me demonstrates that we're kind of replicating a lot of the issues we have voting in the real world. And so when we talk about community voting, we're looking at a system where it's like, well, why are people voting? If you live in the country like I do in the United States, that people just don't vote. And if people are in the system because they were excited about particularly some speculative yields that they were getting, not because they were excited about the punk ethos of the project, what exactly is their incentive to bother to vote, to even learn enough about the project to know how to vote? They could delegate their vote, but there are reasons why in the real world we oftentimes avoid voting delegation. And so you see these systems end up re-centralizing on a very small council. You can look at the issue of a tyranny of the majority. There are projects I've seen that even tout this as features somehow. I'm going to pick on ICP, the Internet Computer Protocol, with their neural infrastructure, where they seem very excited about the idea of a majority of the people being able to completely rewrite, and they even bring up examples, if I remember, of confiscating money from bank accounts and shifting things around in order to deal with scams or negative issues. And I can appreciate that thought. But at the same time, I see in the real world where we have a majority population that is oftentimes conservative to the point of being oppressive of minorities. And we see people who are, we see civilizations that are heavily transphobic. We see civilizations that are misogynistic or racist. And I would have a difficult time imagining that those, or not imagining those, that given the opportunity to vote and say that trans people are no longer able to have money in our banking system because we just don't think that that's a good thing to be associated with our system, where they start voting, whether it even be something as simple as being anti-adult content. I feel like this tyranny of the majority is terrifying. And then we see the final, to bring it back to the other half of these governance systems, we see governance systems that I don't even think are really governance systems. We see governance systems that are doing essentially off-chain companies that are using on-chain shares. I think that those are just selling shares. I think that they should be regulated as if they're selling shares. And I think that we will start to see that kind of regulation. And we've already seen commentary from people at the SEC pointing out that some of these systems just feel like you're selling shares in a company. Think about it. The reason why you sell shares in a company is that people feel like they have an ownership interest in the potentially the treasury, and later being able to obtain a residual or a dividend if there is a lot of profit. That's exactly what these governance systems are for. The way that those work is that the people who are the shareholders can do shareholder votes and shareholder resolutions, and those end up commanding the people who are running the company to actually take certain actions. And if they don't take those actions, then the shareholders lose out. That's why we have the regulations that say that if you are doing something where you're selling something to somebody else that will only be successful due to actions of yourself, that those are things that are regulated securities. All of these DAOs that we're seeing these days, these are regulated securities as far as I'm concerned, and they should be regulated securities. And they are not decentralized, and they completely lack in the ethos. And so this is like a space that anytime I've kind of seen it come up, I tend to get very, let me see, I'm getting, excited here to talk about the extent to which I kind of push back on them, and I try to like isolate them. I try to show them for what they are. I'm just giving a big talk at Off the Chain, talking about the complexities of how people are trying to use these for code updates and the extent to which they end up failing. So that's the role that I think has mostly been somewhat negative.
You got clearly excited about, talking about governance and some of the issues you see there. What about maybe on the positive side? What actually is exciting to you on the positive side in the crypto space today?
I think the thing that I've been most actually interested in has been the extent to which the community has started to really focus on the issue of scalability. I think the word scaling has actually almost been misused for a while now. We've seen projects that are merely faster. People are like, "Oh, that's more scalable." I'm like, "Well, scalability is I can throw more computers at it and it will get faster the more computers I throw at it." If it's merely faster than an existing system, but even with 100,000 computers, it would never get any faster, it doesn't scale. And we've seen systems such as Mina and some of the zero-knowledge computation engines that are designed, or zero-knowledge rollups, that I think are actually looking at that scalability problem and are trying to figure out how to make it so that we can have an arbitrary number of transactions in a constant amount of space, and that we can have multiple computers that are all working together to accomplish goals, rather than having a single, everyone working on the same thing all the time. And that's what I think is most exciting.
What's your preferred definition of scalability? Is it more transactions per second? Is it just cheaper transactions, but maybe, is it scalability from an affordability perspective? Avalanche C chain is not always capable of 1,000 TPS, but sometimes it does.
Avalanche, that does not scale. The more computers you throw at Avalanche, it doesn't get faster. It's not able to do computations faster. It's not able to do computations cheaper. It's not able to do more computations. It is a fixed notion. It gets faster as they improve it a little bit, but it's not scalable. Systems that are scalable are ones where if there are 10 computers running it, it runs at this speed. And if there are 100 computers running it, it runs at a better speed. And again, and what exactly that means, whether that means that it's able to store more transactions. And that's why I look at things like, Mina with its attempt and also, or some of the work being done on Ethereum too, with the idea of have state witnesses that are attempting to figure out how to make it so that not every computer has to store all of the history of the chain. And that instead, only the people who care about those parts of history are able to store those parts of history. That's scalability. Whether it be that the transactions get cheaper, whether they get faster, any of these things, if anything, in current systems, you throw more computers at it, it gets a little slower.
I was just about to say that. Yeah.
Yeah.
7, did you have any thoughts you wanted to add to the governance discussion?
I think Winston Churchill put it that democracy was the best of the worst alternatives for government, something along those lines in the quote. A lot of the drive towards DAOs and decentralization has really been driven by maybe not always a desire to decentralize for the right purposes, but a desire to decentralize for regulatory purposes. And so you see a lot of projects push towards this, and then, as Jay said, the governance is really very imperfect and a very small number of people doing the governance and voting on factors that in many cases are either irrelevant or in some cases are really contract breaches. Jay mentioned the Solend thing, and there was another one. In the case of YGG, there was a vote to not allocate the right amount that came as part of funding and basically cram down an investor. I think we're in the prototypical stages of this, so I don't know if we can throw the baby out with the bathwater on all of these systems and the desires to want to do this kind of governance. In some sense, I think a lot of people are kind of rediscovering what governance means, what government means. Like we've kind of iterated through and tried to discover in some ways how financial systems work or how fundraising works in the case of ICOs, or how currency systems work, and so many things in this space. It is sort of an iterative process. So I remain, generally hopeful that these systems will find beneficial uses, but we may still see some messes along the way.
And finally, what excites you most about what's happening in this space today, whether you want to call it cryptocurrency, blockchain, Web3, or whatever you want to focus on, because you can make all sorts of different definitions for those three words. What do you find most exciting today?
Well, outside of the work we're doing, of course, I think the cultural moment around NFTs is fascinating. Again, that tends to get tarred with this brush of, a pudgy penguin or something random, or, some random PFP that people are throwing on their Twitter, and that's the most exciting thing. But taking that out of, as you can see, I have some art behind me. I've been collecting art for many years, and the art that I collected initially was very street art oriented, which is again this sort of almost punk style, revolutionary, just spray things on the wall, and the next thing you know, you've got Banksy or Shepard Fairey or people like this. Well, Shepard Fairey is now in NFTs, and Banksy is not, even though there's been a number of people who said he was, but he actually wasn't, or maybe he did, as some kind of punk kind of thing to mess with people. And in particular, generative art, guys like Dmitry Cherniak and Tyler Hobbs and the Artblocks platform have brought to the forefront a type of art that was, basically computer-generated, generative, uses algorithms to generate art. And that particular kind of art has suddenly been thrown into the spotlight, and now we see this Christie's and Sotheby's and so on. I think that is fascinating, the fact that people can now own that, in a digital fashion, and then think about it in the same way as they have when they bought print or they bought the original piece of art, and they keep it because they like it. And then there's this liquid market for these things, and all of a sudden there's sort of price discovery on them, and yes, it's volatile and so on and so forth. But that has really changed the lives of many artists that I know who've suddenly gone from obscurity to being in the spotlight, or even just small time artists. People who, as one guy collected his work, he takes these amazing photographs of Aurora Borealis, and it doesn't sell very much, but I collected his work, and then I connected with him, and now we chat on Twitter, and that movement is underestimated in its importance for the creative world. And when you abstract that away and say, okay, let's move beyond art, what does NFTs and what does the concept of owning something digitally mean? And then ultimately, and this is where I link into what Jay was talking about with zero-knowledge proofs, is the concept of kind of owning your identity, and not in this sort of anti-Facebook way, but what if I can start to have characteristics where my identity can be owned in a decentralized way, where I don't have to give Facebook or some government institution every single piece of information about me every single time. Maybe now that concept of digital ownership, which initially now has got this excitement around art and punks and apes and all these things, but can suddenly become, actually, this is a fundamental building block of how we build applications in the future. That's interesting to me. And I don't know if that's going to reinvent social networks or reinvent the metaverse or VR or AR exactly. I think that's what's exciting at this point, is we just don't quite know exactly where that's going. We're seeing it happening in gaming. There's one company invested on that's doing augmented reality gaming, where you go around and capture the flag kind of things, but that information is recorded and you can share that and do games. And I think that as a new generation that's much younger than us and looks at these things and says, okay, I'm coming into this world for the first time, and now these NFTs and this crypto is normal. It's not like I got to accept something new. It's like, that's a normal thing, and now what do I do with it? What do I build and what do I play with? That's interesting.
That's time. Guys, thank you so much, Jay and Seven, for spending extra time with us here today. Really appreciate it. For everybody listening, I hope you really enjoyed this 100th episode of the Priv8 Podcast, formerly known as Follow the White Rabbit, and that you'll keep listening. And until next time, stay free.
You just heard the Priv8 Podcast with your host, Derek E. Silva. Remember to subscribe to the show on Apple, Spotify, Google, or your favorite streaming platform. New episodes available every Wednesday. Thanks for tuning in.